Welcome to our deep dive into the world of Vikings and Scandinavia. Today, we're debunking 30 common misconceptions that have been floating around for far too long, like some kind of mythical sea monster that just won't die. It's time to separate fact from fiction, because frankly, the truth about Vikings is way more interesting than the half-baked myths. So, grab your horned helmets. Oh wait, that's the first misconception. Honestly, it's incredible how one inaccurate piece of headwear can completely derail the historical narrative. But hey, we're all about to get schooled on what Vikings were really like. Get ready to have your minds blown wider than a Viking longship caught in a hurricane. It's going to be a wild ride through history, folks, so buckle up, grab your meat horns, non-skull-shaped ones preferably, and let's raid some historical inaccuracies. Alright, let's address the elephant-sized walrus in the room. Or should I say the horned helmet on the Viking? Because no, my friends, Vikings did not wear horned helmets. It's a myth, a fabrication, a historical inaccuracy so egregious, it makes me want to scream into a fjord. So how did this whole horned helmet thing start? Well, we can thank the 19th century and their penchant for dramatic flair. Specifically, the opera Der Ring des Nibelungen by Richard Wagner featured costumes with, you guessed it, winged helmets. And just like that, a historical inaccuracy was born. It's like saying all cowboys wore 10-gallon hats while riding upside down on robotic bulls. It makes for good entertainment, sure, but it's about as historically accurate as a history book written by a time-traveling squirrel on caffeine. The truth is, practical Vikings would have laughed in the face of anyone trying to wear a cumbersome horned helmet into battle. It's impractical, it's clunky, and frankly, it's just asking for your enemy to get a good grip during hand-to-hand combat. Now, let's shatter another misconception. The idea that Vikings were one big, happy, pillaging family. The truth is far more nuanced, like a fine mead brewed with just the right amount of honey. Because Vikings weren't a single unified group. Think of it this way. Vikings were more like a bunch of different metal bands, all playing at the same festival. Sure, they shared some similarities, a love of longboats, a penchant for raiding, and a healthy respect for a good beard. But they were also distinct groups with their own territories, leaders, and agendas. You had your Swedes, your Danes, your Norwegians, and within those groups, even smaller factions, all vying for power, wealth, and the best spots to overwinter. It was a veritable smorgasbord of Scandinavian seafarers, each with their own unique flavor. To think of them as one homogeneous blob is like saying all reality TV stars are exactly the same. It's a gross oversimplification that ignores the rich tapestry of individual personalities and motivations. And let me tell you, Viking history is full of more drama than a season finale of The Real Housewives of Kattegat. Alright, let's talk about misconception number 3. That Vikings were just hairy, axe-wielding whirlwinds of violence. Now, don't get me wrong, they did love a good raid. I mean, who doesn't enjoy a bit of light pillaging now and then? But to reduce them to just that is like saying Gordon Ramsay's only culinary move is yelling, "You donkey," at hapless chefs. The truth is, Vikings were surprisingly multifaceted. They were skilled craftsmen, traders, and even, dare I say it, pioneers of exploration. These guys weren't just about grabbing your silver and running back to Scandinavia. They established trade routes spanning vast distances, connecting the east and west like some sort of 9th century Amazon Prime, but with significantly more longboats and probably a lot more dysentery. They traded everything from furs and timber to slaves and luxury goods, proving that beneath those blood-soaked furs beat the hearts of shrewd capitalists. So, while they may have dabbled in a bit of casual home invasion from time to time, remember, Vikings had a diverse portfolio, and raiding was just one branch of their rather impressive resume. Now let's address the elephant, or perhaps the unwashed, smelly Viking in the room. Yes, popular history would have you believe they were about as hygienic as a badger's armpit. But surprise, surprise, turns out the Vikings were actually quite the neat freaks. I know, I'm as shocked as you are. Archaeological evidence suggests they bathed regularly, often using saunas for a good steam clean. They even had tweezers, ear cleaners, and combs because apparently, even when you're busy conquering villages, a man's gotta maintain those luscious Nordic locks. Look, imagine spending months at sea, crammed into a longboat with your mates. Personal hygiene wouldn't just be a suggestion, it would be a matter of national security. And let's not forget, these were people who took pride in their appearance. They adorned themselves with jewelry, intricate tattoos, and even used eyeliner. Yes, eyeliner. So the next time you picture a Viking, ditch the image of a grime-covered barbarian. Instead, envision a stylish, well-groomed individual who wouldn't be caught dead without their trusty comb and a touch of kohl around the eyes. Okay, time to debunk a myth so pervasive it's practically achieved legendary status. The whole Vikings drinking from skulls thing. I hate to break it to you, but this is about as historically accurate as a T-Rex wearing a monocle. While it makes for a fantastic visual, and let's be honest, who hasn't secretly wished they could chug mead from a vanquished foe's skull at least once? The reality is far less metal. Archaeologists, those killjoys of historical revisionism, have found absolutely zero evidence to support this skullduggery. What they did find, however, were plenty of horns, wooden cups, and even fancy imported glassware because, believe it or not, Vikings understood the concept of a dishwasher-safe mug. Now, they weren't opposed to a bit of bone-based craftsmanship. They used it for tools, jewelry, and even gaming pieces. But when it came to quenching their thirst, they drew the line at turning their enemies' skulls into makeshift sippy cups. So, while the image of a burly Viking warrior downing ale from a skull might make for a great heavy metal album cover, it's time to lay this myth to rest. Alright, let's address the elephant, or perhaps more accurately, the giant, in the room. You know, the image of Vikings towering over their enemies like sentient redwood trees? Turns out that's about as accurate as a seagull using a sextant. While some Vikings were undoubtedly brawny lads, archaeological evidence suggests the average Viking was actually a bit shorter than the average European today. We're talking maybe 5'7" for men, 5'3" for women. Not exactly Andre the Giant territory, is it? This misconception likely stems from a combination of factors. 1. Our romanticized image of Vikings often emphasizes their physical prowess. 2. Surviving Viking armor can be misleading, as it was often designed to be imposing. And 3, well, who doesn't love a good tall tale, right? Except in this case, the tale is taller than the Vikings themselves. So, next time you picture a Viking, imagine them a bit more down to earth, literally. They might have been fierce warriors, but they weren't giants roaming the land, snatching princesses and battling krakens with their bare hands. Though, I'll admit, that would make for a much more interesting History Channel miniseries. Now let's talk Viking ships. Specifically, the persistent myth that these were clunky, barely seaworthy tubs held together by hope, prayers, and the occasional chewing gum. This is utter nonsense, on par with saying pigeons are just rats with good PR. Viking longships were, in fact, marvels of engineering. They were fast, maneuverable, and capable of navigating both open seas and shallow rivers. Imagine a sleek, terrifying water spider, capable of popping up on your coastline before you could say, "Wait, are those guys wearing helmets with..." Never mind. These ships were built using a technique called clinker construction, with overlapping planks of wood, giving them incredible strength and flexibility. They were also shallow drafted, meaning they could sail right up rivers and land directly on beaches, which, let's be honest, is a pretty effective way to make an entrance. So yeah, the Vikings were skilled shipbuilders. They had to be, considering they explored vast areas, from North America to the Caspian Sea. To call their ships primitive is like calling Usain Bolt a bit nippy. It's technically accurate, but it misses the sheer scale of their achievement. Here's another common misconception about Vikings, that they clung to their pagan beliefs with the tenacity of a barnacle on a whale's backside until their dying breath. Now, while it's true they weren't exactly queuing up to join the Pope's fan club, the reality of Viking religious beliefs is a tad more nuanced. See, the Viking age spanned centuries, and during that time their religious landscape underwent some serious renovations. While they initially worshipped a pantheon of Norse gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, the whole gang, Christianity started creeping in like a polite, persistent houseguest around the 10th and 11th centuries. This wasn't some overnight conversion, mind you. It was a gradual process, often involving a bit of theological mixing and matching. Think of it less like flipping a light switch and more like installing a dimmer. You've still got your old gods hanging around, but now there's this new, increasingly popular deity sharing the spotlight. So while some Vikings undoubtedly held onto their pagan beliefs, many others adopted Christianity, often integrating it with their existing traditions. It's a classic tale of cultural exchange, really. Although I'm guessing the exchange rate between Thor's hammer and Jesus' sandals was probably a bit lopsided. Alright, let's talk about Vikings and literacy. Contrary to popular belief, Vikings weren't just illiterate barbarians. They had a writing system called runes. Imagine carving messages into wood or stone. Runes popped up everywhere. from weapons to jewelry, even giant stones. The point is, Vikings knew how to use their words. So you thought Vikings were just hanging out in Scandinavia, freezing and pillaging? Think again. These guys were like the original backpackers, with longboats and pillaging. They spread further than a cat meme on the internet. Iceland, Greenland, even North America. They beat Columbus by centuries, without fancy tools. They settled, traded, and made themselves at home. Sure, there was raiding because, well, Vikings, but also integration and cultural exchange. They were settlers, explorers, and traders. Who knew? Alright, let's talk about Vikings and their favorite pastime. No, not competitive beard braiding. I'm talking about war. Or rather, the misconception that it was all they did. They enjoyed a good axe fight, but they weren't constantly at war. Vikings were brilliant at war, but they had other interests too. Surviving harsh winters, trading, farming, crafting, the usual stuff. They were more than just warmongers. They had families, communities, and a complex social structure. And sometimes, they even resolved differences peacefully. Alright, let's talk Viking law, or as I like to imagine they called it, Thor's Code, Hammer of Justice. Now, you might picture Vikings settling disputes with a headbutt contest judged by Odin himself. And while that would be fantastic television, the reality is a bit more nuanced. And by nuanced, I mean they actually had laws. Shocking, I know. It wasn't all arbitrary violence and yelling, "You've dishonored my beard." They had established legal systems with things called things, which, despite sounding like a rejected Muppet, were actually assemblies where legal matters were discussed and decided. Think of it as their version of Parliament, but with less filibustering and hopefully more mead. These assemblies played a crucial role in Viking society, addressing everything from property disputes to inheritance to, yes, even acts of violence. Because even Vikings understood that sometimes you need to settle things peacefully, preferably before someone resorted to setting someone else on fire. So, while the image of lawless barbarians might make for a good action movie, the truth is, Vikings had a surprisingly sophisticated legal system for their time. They valued justice, fairness, and probably a good mead bargain. Ah, the Vikings, hairy barbarians who only cared about pillaging, plundering, and personal hygiene, or so the stereotype goes. But let's be clear, calling Vikings uncivilized is not only inaccurate, it's also incredibly rude. The Vikings had culture, art, music, and craftsmanship that would put your Pinterest board to shame. They crafted intricate jewelry, wove beautiful tapestries, and built ships that could cross oceans. So, the next time someone says Vikings were uncivilized, show them the Oseberg ship, the ancient equivalent of a Ferrari. Alright, let's talk Viking hair, or more specifically, the myth that they were all rocking those flowing blonde locks. While some Vikings were blonde, they had a variety of hair colors. The Vikings, much like their modern-day descendants, were a diverse bunch. They came from different regions and had different genetic backgrounds. Historical evidence suggests that Vikings had a variety of hair colors. They even dyed their hair, with some opting for lighter shades. The point is, Vikings were not a monolithic group of identical blonde warriors. Alright, let's talk Viking fearlessness. That image of a Viking laughing in the face of death? Not entirely accurate. Even those who could navigate by the stars had a healthy dose of fear. Imagine the North Sea in winter. Waves pulling you down, wind sand blasting your skin. In a wooden boat, hoping Odin isn't peckish today. Vikings were superstitious. They appeased gods with sacrifices, animal and human sacrifices. They feared the gods, watery graves, and running out of mead. Right, let's talk about family. Vikings placed a lot of importance on family and kinship. Their society was based around family units. Strong family bonds were essential for survival. Families worked together, farmed together, and sometimes even raided together. Viking women wielded considerable power within the household. So they weren't just emotionally stunted barbarians. Okay, let's address this whole Vikings were isolated thing. You know, the image of them holed up in their Scandinavian ice forts? Turns out they were not averse to a bit of travel. Voyages to North America, Russia, Europe, even the Middle East. They were master traders, exchanging goods and ideas. Viking settlements were melting pots of cultures. Archaeological digs reveal a society far more interconnected than previously thought. Alright, let's talk about Viking women. Because apparently, some people think they just sat around braiding each other's beards. Which, by the way, would be impressive considering the whole lack of beards situation. Anyway, Viking women were absolute badasses. They ran households, managed farms, and even went on trading expeditions. Imagine sailing across the North Sea to haggle for silver, all while keeping your eyeliner on point. That takes some serious skill, and if you think that's impressive, hold on to your horned helmets, because it gets better. We have archaeological evidence and historical accounts of women warriors, known as shield maidens. Now, they weren't commonplace, but they existed, and they were a force to be reckoned with. These women fought alongside men, proving that you didn't need a Y chromosome to wield a sword effectively. So, the next time someone tries to tell you Vikings were a boys' club, you can hit them with a history book. Or, just show them this video. I'm sure they'll be convinced after hearing me rant about it for 5 minutes straight. Yes, Vikings were known for their, shall we say, persuasive acquisition of other people's valuables. But to say that's all they did is like saying Gordon Ramsay's just a guy who shouts at food. There's so much more to it. Vikings were skilled craftsmen, farmers, fishermen, traders, explorers, and even politicians. They built ships that could cross oceans, crafted intricate jewelry, and established trade routes spanning continents. They were masters of their environment, adapting to harsh conditions and making the most of what they had. And let's not forget their exploration prowess. These were the people who discovered Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, centuries before Columbus stumbled his way over. They navigated by the stars, braved treacherous seas, and established settlements in new lands. So, no, Vikings weren't just pirates. They were a complex society with a diverse range of skills and occupations. They were builders, explorers, and innovators, leaving a lasting impact on history that goes far beyond just plundering. Look, when you think Vikings, you probably picture rugged warriors, not farmers. But farming was the backbone of Viking society. They farmed barley, oats, rye, and wheat for bread, porridge, and ale. Yes, ale. Because what's the point of conquering new lands if you can't enjoy a good pint? They also raised livestock for meat, milk, and wool. And they were ingenious, using terracing and seaweed for farming. Even the fiercest warrior needs a good breakfast, probably from a Viking farm. Alright, misconception number 21. All Vikings died young, probably in a blaze of glory, ripped apart by a bear or something equally metal. That's a lovely image, very Valhalla chic, but also wildly inaccurate. Sure, life expectancy wasn't exactly stellar back then, hovering around 40. But that average is skewed by things like infant mortality and, occasionally getting stabbed by a rival with a very specific opinion on land ownership. If you were lucky enough to survive childhood and not become a cautionary tale about the dangers of friendly axe-throwing competitions, you could actually reach a ripe old age. And by ripe, I mean older than a teenager who just discovered mead. These silver foxes might not have been leading raiding parties, but they held wisdom and experience, which, in a society that hadn't quite gotten the hang of written language, was more valuable than a long ship full of plundered silverware. Plus, imagine the stories they could tell. Misconception number 22 claims Vikings were all about that pillaging life, devoid of any artistic inclination. Apparently, they just stomped around, silently judging everyone's interior design choices. Let's be clear, Vikings loved a good party. And what's a party without music? They had lyres, flutes, drums, and even something called a lure, which is a long trumpet-like instrument that probably sounded like a dying moose if played incorrectly. Their music wasn't just drunken tavern sing-alongs either, although I'm sure there were plenty of those. They had complex sagas, tales of heroes and gods set to music. Imagine a very intense, slightly unhinged history lesson, but with more chanting. So, next time you picture a Viking longship sailing towards the horizon, don't imagine it in eerie silence. Imagine it soundtracked by some intense Scandinavian folk metal. Here's a fun one. Vikings were godless heathens who scoffed at the mere mention of anything remotely spiritual. Now, I'm no theologian, but that's just lazy stereotyping. Vikings had a rich and complex belief system, a pantheon of gods who were just as flawed and dramatic as any reality TV family. You had Odin, the one-eyed Allfather, Thor, who apparently had anger management issues, and Freya, who, let's be honest, was the real brains of the operation. These weren't just abstract concepts either. Vikings believed their gods directly influenced their lives, from the weather to the outcome of battles. And let's be real, if you were about to set sail in a wooden boat across a very angry North Sea, you'd be praying to every deity you could think of, too. So no, Vikings weren't atheists. They just worshipped gods who enjoyed a good brawl and the occasional tank of mead. You know, relatable deities. Alright, let's address this frankly ridiculous notion that Vikings, those hairy axe-wielding adventurers, didn't know how to have a good time. It's like saying a penguin doesn't know how to swim, or that the British royal family doesn't enjoy a good public meltdown. It simply doesn't hold water or mead, as it were. Archaeological evidence paints a much more nuanced and, dare I say, fun-loving picture. We're talking feasts with music, storytelling, and athletic competitions. Imagine, if you will, a burly Viking named Bjorn absolutely crushing it in a rousing game of cub, which is essentially lawn bowling with a Viking twist. And yes, before you ask, there was drinking involved. Lots of drinking. But it wasn't all drunken brawls and mead-fueled mayhem. Vikings enjoyed games of strategy like Hnefatafl, a war game played with intricately carved pieces. They even had board games. So the next time you picture a Viking, don't just imagine them pillaging and plundering. Picture them laughing, playing, and generally having a grand old time. Because even the most hardened Viking knew how to let loose and enjoy themselves. Let's dismantle this ludicrous idea that every Viking was a bloodthirsty warrior, roaming the seas with a battle axe in one hand and a tankard of mead in the other. It's like assuming everyone in Texas rides a horse, or everyone in Florida is a retiree wrestling an alligator. While undeniably more interesting, it's simply not the full picture. Viking society, much like our own, was comprised of a diverse range of professions. Sure, you had your warriors, your raiders, your conquerors of nations, but you also had farmers, fishermen, blacksmiths, carpenters, and even, whisper it, poets. These were people who lived, loved, and most importantly, paid taxes just like the rest of us. Imagine, if you will, a Viking named Olaf. Now, Olaf isn't particularly fond of violence. He'd much rather be crafting exquisite jewelry or perhaps dabbling in a bit of poetry. The point is, not every Viking was a muscle-bound, axe-wielding berserker. To assume so is to do a great disservice to the rich tapestry of Viking society. The notion that Vikings were nothing more than maritime muggers, incapable of engaging in anything beyond smash and grab economics, is about as accurate as saying pigeons are just rats with good PR. Vikings, my friends, were surprisingly adept at the art of the deal. They didn't just take, they traded. And they traded a lot. We're talking intricate trade networks spanning continents, from the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the bustling marketplaces of Constantinople. They traded furs, timber, honey, slaves, yes, that's a dark chapter, and even luxury goods like silks and spices. Think of them as the Amazon Prime of the medieval world, minus the questionable labor practices and Jeff Bezos' unsettling laugh. Their success in trade speaks to their savvy as negotiators and their understanding of supply and demand, which, let's be honest, is more than we can say for some people who try to haggle at flea markets. So the next time you envision a Viking longship on the horizon, don't just assume they're there to pillage and plunder. They might just be bringing you a sweet deal on some walrus ivory or a hand-stitched tapestry. Alright, strap in, because this one might make your brain do a little flip. We've been throwing around the term Viking as if it's some sort of rigid ethnicity, like they had a Viking box to tick on their census forms, which, by the way, they didn't, because census taking in the Viking Age would have been a logistical nightmare. The reality is, Viking was more of an occupation, like baker or tax collector, though significantly cooler than the latter. Sure, a lot of them hailed from Scandinavia, your Denmarks, your Norways, your Swedens, places so lovely they could make a grown man weep with joy. But it wasn't some exclusive club with a no foreigners sign on the door. Think of it like this: if a particularly ambitious Irish lad decided, you know what, raiding monasteries and looking fierce is the life for me, sailed off and joined a Viking crew. Well, guess what? He's a Viking now. Never underestimate the power of cultural assimilation through pillaging. The Viking world, much like a modern music festival, was a delightful melting pot of cultures, all brought together by a shared love of adventure, questionable hygiene, and the irresistible allure of someone else's treasure. So, you picture Vikings, you're probably imagining rugged individuals with a penchant for eyeliner and setting things on fire, right? Roaming the seas, living out of their longboats, occasionally stopping to build a town, you know, just for a laugh. And while that image isn't entirely inaccurate, except for the eyeliner part, that was more of an Egyptian thing, it does paint an incomplete picture of their architectural prowess, because, surprise, Vikings actually did build towns. They weren't just nomadic hordes, flitting from one raid to another. They were surprisingly adept at urban planning, and by urban planning, I obviously mean figuring out how to fit as many houses, workshops, and mead halls within a fortified wall as humanly possible. These Viking towns were hubs of trade, craftsmanship, and, dare I say, culture. They had everything a burgeoning Viking settlement needed: blacksmiths, leatherworkers, artisans, who could carve incredibly intricate designs into pieces of wood that you then immediately set on fire. The point is, Vikings were more than just raiders. They were builders, craftspeople, and surprisingly savvy city dwellers. Alright, let's talk about Viking victories, or rather, the distinct lack thereof sometimes. History Channel would have you believe they were the Navy SEALs of the medieval world. But for every Lindisfarne raid, there was a less successful Tuesday. Take the Viking siege of Paris in 885. They faced walls and bridges. Spoiler alert, it rarely works. They had triumphs, but also setbacks and mistakes. Now you might be picturing the Viking Age ending with some dramatic Hollywood finale, but the reality is far less exciting. The Vikings didn't just disappear in a puff of dragon smoke. Their decline was gradual. Like a houseplant you forgot to water, Europe started catching up militarily, and many Vikings converted to Christianity. Warmer temperatures made farming more viable. They slowly integrated into medieval Europe. And there you have it, 30 misconceptions about the Vikings and Scandinavia thoroughly debunked. Hopefully, you've learned that Vikings were more than just bloodthirsty barbarians with a penchant for horned helmets. They were explorers, traders, farmers, and even, dare I say, surprisingly good at personal hygiene. History is often more complex than the myths we create, and the Vikings are a perfect example of that. So next time you see a dude with a horned helmet at a Renaissance fair, don't be afraid to walk up to him and say, that's a bit of a historical inaccuracy, before calmly explaining the intricacies of 9th century Scandinavian headwear. Or, just enjoy the turkey leg and move on. Your call. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more deep dives into fascinating topics.